Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. Today's topic is chapter 3, and the chapter is actually on gender and culture. And there's a lot that we could say about both. Both elements are incredibly important when we stop to think about their impact on our communication. But for the purposes of this lecture, I'm just going to be focusing on culture, and we'll talk about a few concepts. It's probably going to be one of the shorter lectures, not because there's not a lot I would love to say, but because I'm trying to keep the conversation focused to some of the takeaways that we will then apply to our homework and also some of the lesson material going forward. But I do recommend that you read the entire chapter because as we go through different experiences in life, we're going to interact with people from different cultures. So for today's specific lesson, we'll be talking about the definition of culture. I think that's an important place to start for this discussion. In groups versus out groups, and then also prejudice. And if you remember last week we talked, or in the last module, we talked a little bit about perception of others, and we said sometimes when we perceive things that we believe to be true about other people, like maybe we perceive a certain height or a certain weight or certain ethnicity, and then we decide that, some of those things are true for everybody who looks the certain way or reminds us of that kind of person. That's stereotyping. And where we want to be careful with stereotyping is when we start placing value on other people based on our stereotypes. So if I see someone who looks, every time I see someone who looks like this, I think of a negative stereotype. That obviously can keep me from being an effective communicator, and it can certainly keep me from having relationships with people that could bring me a lot of value. And when you're in the workplace, being able to work with a lot of different people, regardless of the field that you're going to go into, that's going to be your ability to work with others will be a huge asset. So this is why we spend time talking about culture. I like to start with the definition of culture. In today's video, this is probably where I'll spend most of the time, is talking about, well, what is culture? In the past, when I've had classes in person, I ask students, okay, so you tell me, talk to your group, figure out what does culture mean? Don't look it up, just tell me what you think it means. And typically, the general definition I get about culture is, oh, well, those are people who are different than me, and usually they're from different countries or they have different skin color. And I think, okay, well, some of that may be true, but that's not necessarily what culture is in its entirety. So I would recommend that you think about culture a little bit broader than that, to include any group with a shared system of meaning. And so what you're looking at here is an illustration from our book, figure 4.1. So it's in our prior chapter 4. But this is in our book, and it talks about things like ethnicity, religion, abilities, region, like where the person lives now necessarily, or like parts of town, race, sexual orientation, age, gender, and we know sex is not listed here, but sex and gender are different items. So we would talk about sex in terms of male or female, and then gender would be masculine or feminine. And then, of course, there's the whole spectrum of gender or gender expression that we could talk about. But I want to really broaden the scope to include even things like hobbies or skill sets. For example, people who play video games, excuse me, as a major part of their life, those people are part of a culture. And anybody who operates in that group understands that shared system of meaning, because there are things they don't have to say necessarily to one another because they belong to the same group. Also, anything that you see here, but anything that makes a group unique or different could be put together to create a culture. So that's, I think, really important to understand. It's much more than just skin color or what country somebody is from, because the next step, I think, of that, of just beyond awareness is, okay, it's easy to look at people, let's say, if we're talking about age, people in this age demographic or bracket of ages, right? Maybe some of you watching are in your 20s and you think, people in their 40s are old or out of touch or uncool. It's possible. I'm in my mid 40s, so that's possible. But I'd like to think that maybe not all of that's true. You might have a certain perception of me, and if some of you are watching and you're in your 40s, you think, no, I'm absolutely cool. Those of us who are in that age bracket will see ourselves differently, maybe, than people outside of that age bracket. So awareness is great, but then we also want to think about if we're going to be competent communicators, instead of looking at what's different about us, what are the different boxes we can put ourselves in, we want to try to think about where do our boxes overlap with one another. So for example, you could, as an exercise, you could start putting boxes around categories that describe you. So if I were making a list, I might have a box that says female. I might have another box that says educator. I have another box that says cat owner, or, really cats are the boss. So, cats own me, basically. So on and so forth, right? I might put a box for religion. I might put a box for politics. We have to remember that even if we're part of a culture, we all have lots and lots of boxes. And it doesn't do us a lot of good for us to look at someone else and see, you're in that box of, let's say, criminals. So if that's true of you, I'm just going to put you in the one box and call you a criminal. And that's different than me. I've never been a criminal. So therefore, I can make judgments about you because you're obviously, in a bad person kind of box. But what that keeps us from doing is seeing the entire person. It's possible that maybe the person is a criminal because he or she did something that was illegal at the time and now is not illegal. In which case, that could have been somebody you know. If it is somebody you know, are you going to still put them in the same box? So again, the discussion first is just being aware that culture is far more broadly defined than just those couple of things. It's any group, really. And then beyond that, we can think, okay, how am I maybe similar to these people? And you might be asking yourself, well, why would I want to worry about how I'm similar to other people? Hopefully, you are asking that question. My suggestion to you would be so that you become an effective communicator, can get along with people that, are in your workplace or in life in general, but then end up bringing you value, because the more people you start putting in boxes and then labeling those boxes as less than or different, your boxes become smaller and smaller. Your circle of, I don't want to say influence, but I would say your kind of circle of identity, if you will, doesn't continue to grow. So for example, if I only see uh, people from one particular country one way, and so I never get to know them, I never get to learn what I could from somebody from that country. I have a good friend who is from Albania. I don't know a lot about geography, and unfortunately, I don't know a lot about history, but I know that she represents maybe a culture of people that other people could look at and go, well, she's from that place, she speaks that other language, therefore she must be like this, what I've decided other people are. Unfortunately, I did not do that. Fortunately, she did not do that for me as somebody with all of my boxes and my cultures. And we don't share everything. We don't have all of the same views, but we can choose to focus on what is similar. And by doing that, I've been able to have a really good friend who has taught me quite a bit over the last almost 20 years now. So again, I'm spending time on that intentionally, and I know some of you will fast forward, but hopefully you're just letting it play in the background at least. That's a huge piece of our ability to communicate effectively, is being aware and then being willing to see the overlaps, if you will, between our cultures. That can be a little bit difficult. Onto the next slide as we think about what's called an in-group versus an out-group. We talked a little bit last week about how we see ourselves in more flattering ways typically than maybe we see other people. So when good things happen to us, we think, oh, it's because we're great people. And when bad things happen to other people, we think, oh, it's because maybe they're not great people, right? In-group and out-group are like a similar path of logic, if you will. An in-group are people that you perceive because they're connected to you. You see them as sharing your attitudes, values, and beliefs. And you almost sort of give them, I don't want to say necessarily more respect, but certainly more welcoming, more appreciative of who they are because you see them as part of your group. An out group would be people who are not culturally similar to you. And so when you think of them as someone who's not part of your culture or an out group, that's where we have a tendency to maybe make more stereotypes and certainly fall into some prejudice tendencies, which we'll talk about in a second. I have found that when we start using the words they and them to, I should probably do this, they and them, which is two quotations, um, it distances us. It disconnects us from those other people. And what I mean by that is if I say, oh, those, let's say students, they never learn. Those younger students, they never take notes. They never bother to do homework. They. Again, if I put everybody in this out grouper, if I put them in a box and call them they, and I identify them as different than me, there's just a disconnect. And again, as you can imagine, that makes it hard then to have the relationships working or personal with those other people because we're busy focusing on the differences instead of the similarities. And again, the last major thing I wanted to talk about for this particular chapter is prejudice. And as I said, we talked a little bit in chapter 2 about stereotypes. So this is just building on that. When we take a stereotype, which is an assumption based on the little bit of information we have, and we decide it's true of everybody who kind of shares some similarities, when they become so rigid and then we attach some kind of, again, value, we're not just stereotyping, but then we do create some kind of prejudice or prejudging. I can't think of anybody who wants to be prejudged. I just can't. By the way they look, by the way they talk, by the people they are around, the car they drive. I can't think of anybody who's like, yep, totally prejudge me on all these things. And even if they did, if they paint the perfect picture on social media, it's not really a true judgment anyway. And there will be people who don't like what they see, even when they, if I project this image of perfection, there will be people who can see through that or don't agree with the choices I'm making. The key here is, again, we have the opportunity to be mindful of the evaluation that we're making on other people. I think it's interesting to talk about the major types of prejudice because I don't know that people think there's more than one way. So the first is benevolent prejudice. Benevolent is usually seen as like giving or maybe good-natured. Benevolent prejudice is when you think of a particular group as inferior, but also friendly and maybe competent. Just as long as those people know their place and they know they're not better than me, then we're good, right? Because we need to just make sure we have this in balance. But bless their hearts, they're nice people, and I hate to say, when I talk to students and I ask them if they are prejudiced at all, most students will say, no, not at all. And then I ask again and again, and we start talking through examples, and I find out everybody's got some group. And one of the ones that I think is common is actually the elderly. We tend to think of them as, friendly, but, maybe somewhat competent, but definitely inferior. They're not as fast. They're not as strong. And when we come from that place, we treat them differently. And I think other people can pick up on our energy. So that's what benevolent prejudice is, when somebody's smiling in your face, but in their mind, they're thinking, yeah, but I'm better than you. And then what we're probably all most familiar with is called hostile prejudice. And that's when we're much more outspoken about it, outwardly expressive. We either say or make it really clear. We see them as unfriendly, also incompetent, but definitely less than. And we're, like I said, much more vocal about it. The hostile part of it, in my mind, what makes it hostile, or the reason it gets to become hostile, is also because we've made these assumptions that have turned into stereotypes, and then we have some emotion behind those stereotypes. So again, if there's a group of people I interact with and I had a previous interaction with someone that looked like that group or sounded or in some way reminded me, and I had a really bad experience, I'm going to maybe want to see everybody in that group in a possibly hostile way. And if I attach value and decide my value is greater than theirs, then it's hostile prejudice. And I have these two pictures here of a frowny face and a smiley face. The smiley represents benevolent prejudice, which again is me smiling in your face, still thinking I'm superior. And then hostile prejudice is an outright frowny face. There's no guessing at where I'm coming from. And I always ask my classes, what would you rather? If you were faced with prejudice, what would you rather? And usually people say, I'd rather just have the hostile prejudice. At least I know where the other people are coming from. And I guess hostile is variable, or it's not a variable. What's the word? Subjective term, right? Hostile for me could mean one thing, and hostile for you means something else. So I don't want to say there's one right way to see this, but we don't have control of other people and how they prejudge us. We do have control over how we perceive and if we prejudge other people. So that part's completely within our control. So we talked about the definition of culture, we talked about in-group versus out-group, and then we also talked about prejudice. I hope that that's really helpful for you, and I hope that you will stay tuned and watch the next lecture for chapter 4. Bye, everybody.